Imagine being the world's biggest empire and suddenly realizing that the country you once mentored, funded, and helped rise is now the one quietly pulling the plug on your power. That was Britain in 1956. It was not defeated on a battlefield, and no foreign army stormed its shores. Instead, it was cornered by its closest ally. In the middle of the Suez Crisis, London expected Washington to step in and save the day. But the United States did not. And in that moment, Britain understood something devastating. The greatest weapon in the world was not a navy or an army. It was the US dollar. If you clicked on this video, you are exactly in the right place. I am going to walk you through the part of the Suez Crisis that most documentaries barely touch, the financial pressure, the quiet threats, and the moment the United States discovered it could change world events without firing a single shot. By the end, you will understand why the Suez Crisis was not just a military miscalculation, but a financial execution that forced Britain to back down. And you will see how this single moment quietly marked the true end of the British Empire and the beginning of a new world order. In the early 1950s, Britain moved through the world with the confidence of a nation that still believed it sat at the center of global power. On paper, it looked impressive. Colonies stretching across continents, bases around the world, influence in Europe, and a seat at every major international table. But beneath that proud exterior was a country that had been financially drained by World War II, a country that was living on loans, hopeful illusions, and memories of a world where the British Empire called the shots. The United States had already emerged as the new financial superpower, but Britain did not fully acknowledge it. The pound, once the backbone of global trade, was weak and vulnerable, while the dollar was becoming the currency the world trusted. It was a quiet shift, almost invisible day to day, but the consequences were enormous. Britain walked into the 1950s like a retired champion, still showing off the belt, but everyone else had moved on. This illusion mattered most in the Middle East, where Britain still believed it had the right and the ability to shape events. After the war, the world's dependence on oil was rising at a speed no one had predicted. Factories, vehicles, ships, planes, entire economies were running on oil, and the Middle East was the heart of it. Control of the Suez Canal meant control of the world's energy lifeline. It was not just a waterway, it was the artery through which Europe's and Asia's future flowed. For Britain and France, that canal represented power, stability, and a lingering sense of ownership. When Egypt decided to nationalize it, they did not simply see it as a political move. They saw it as a challenge to their global status, a threat to their influence, and an insult to the era they still believed had not ended. At the center of this challenge was a young Egyptian leader who did not play by the old rules. Gamal Abdel Nasser was charismatic, bold, and deeply committed to the idea of an independent Egypt that would not bow to Western powers. He spoke the language of nationalism at a time when former colonies were beginning to question why they should accept European control at all. Nasser was not reckless, but he was not predictable either. He did not want Egypt to be a pawn in the Cold War. He wanted it to be a leader in the Arab world. Britain underestimated him from the start. They saw him as just another regional figure who would fall in line once pressure was applied. They misread his determination, his influence, and the powerful wave of anti-colonial sentiment rising across the Middle East. The United States, on the other hand, had a more complicated view. Washington did not fully trust Nasser, but did not see him as an enemy. In American eyes, he was someone who could potentially stabilize the region without being loyal to either superpower. The U.S. preferred influence over dominance, and it did not want Britain's old imperial habits to ignite a crisis that could pull the Soviets deeper into the Middle East. To Washington, the world was changing. Old-style empire was dying, and credibility depended on supporting decolonization, not trying to stop it. Britain did not see it that way. British leaders believed that their history, their sacrifices in the war, and their alliance with the United States would ensure American support if things escalated. They assumed that if they pushed hard enough, the U.S. would back them, or at least remain neutral. They assumed that global power worked the way it always had. The empire takes a stand and allies fall in line. But the world had moved on, while Britain was still pretending nothing had changed. What made the situation even more tragic was that Britain did not recognize its own vulnerability. It did not see how dependent it had become on American financial support. It did not grasp how weak the pound really was. It did not see that the future was being shaped not by colonial borders or naval fleets, but by currency, credit, and global financial leverage. Britain was acting like it still had the economic strength of the 19th century, when in reality, it was living on borrowed time and borrowed money. In the Middle East, this clash of old ambition and new realities came to a breaking point. Britain believed that taking back control of the canal would reassert its dominance. It believed the world would respect the move, or at least tolerate it. But Egypt's nationalization, Nasser's rising influence, and America's changing priorities created a storm that Britain could not see coming. It set the stage for a confrontation that would expose the truth Britain had spent a decade avoiding. It was no longer the world's empire. The age of economic power had arrived, and Britain was not prepared for it. And this is where everything snaps, because Britain still thought power worked the old way. But America was about to teach them what power looked like in the New World. In the autumn of 1956, far from the public eye and far from any official diplomatic channel, a group of men met quietly in a villa in Sèvres, France. They arrived separately, using different routes, with their movements masked even from many of their own governments. Britain, France, and Israel were about to make a decision that would shake the Middle East and redefine the balance of global power. Behind closed doors, away from journalists, allies, and even their own parliaments, they crafted a plan that they believed would be quick, decisive, and clean. It was the kind of plan that sounds clever at 2 a.m. in a locked hotel room and disastrous in the light of day. The logic was simple on paper. Israel would strike Egypt first, moving rapidly toward the Sinai Peninsula. Once fighting began, Britain and France would step in, claiming they were acting as neutral peacekeepers to protect the Suez Canal. They would issue a joint ultimatum to both sides, knowing Egypt would never accept it. This would give them the excuse to intervene militarily, bomb Egyptian positions, and seize the canal under the banner of restoring order. It was a script designed to mask aggression as responsibility, occupation as stabilization, and imperial ambition as international duty. The real goal was to topple Nasser, take back the canal, and remind the world that Britain and France were still major powers in the Middle East. There was a sense of desperation behind the planning. Britain was scared of losing its last big symbol of global influence. France was furious with Nasser for supporting Algerian rebels. Israel felt threatened by Egypt's rising military strength. Together, they convinced themselves that this covert alliance was not only justified but necessary. They believed they were acting boldly, strategically, and in unity. What none of them fully understood was that they were about to walk off a cliff. A large part of their confidence came from one dangerous assumption. They were certain the United States would back them, or at least tolerate what they were about to do. In their minds, the logic was ironclad. Egypt was drifting closer to the Soviet Union. Nasser was unpredictable and increasingly influential in the Arab world. The Cold War was at its peak. Surely, they thought, America would want Nasser weakened or removed. Surely the United States would see this as a blow against Soviet influence in the region. They miscalculated badly. Britain, in particular, believed its relationship with the U.S. guaranteed support. The special relationship had been a lifeline during World War II. Britain saw itself as America's closest ally, the country that stood by Washington through every crisis. So when British leaders discussed the plan, they assumed that even if the United States had concerns, it would ultimately fall in line. They did not consider that the world had changed dramatically since 1945. They did not realize that America had no desire to help old colonial powers reassert themselves. They completely overlooked the fact that the U.S. cared far more about global stability, oil security, and avoiding direct conflict with the Soviet Union than about saving Britain's imperial pride. From President Dwight Eisenhower's perspective, the secret plan was reckless, outdated, and dangerously short-sighted. Eisenhower had no interest in letting a colonial-style war erupt in the Middle East. He did not want to see Arab states push toward the Soviet Union. He did not want a crisis that could destabilize oil supplies, invite Russian intervention, or fracture the fragile alliances of the Cold War. To him, the world was moving toward decolonization, not back to imperial occupations. When he looked at what Britain and France were plotting, he did not see responsible partners. He saw something else entirely. To Eisenhower, Britain was not acting like a responsible ally. It was acting like a desperate empire clinging to relevance. What made the entire situation even more explosive was how blindsided the United States was. Britain and France deliberately hid their coordination with Israel. When the fighting began, Washington initially believed the conflict was a separate regional issue. But as the pieces fell into place, American officials realized this was not a spontaneous war. It was a stage drama orchestrated by countries that were supposed to be partners in maintaining global stability. The more Eisenhower learned, the angrier he became. He saw the collusion as a betrayal of trust. He saw the potential consequences as catastrophic. And he was determined not to let three countries drag the world toward a larger conflict. To him, Britain's secret plan was not bold or cunning. It was dangerous, arrogant, and naive. The tragedy of it all was that Britain genuinely believed it was acting with America's unspoken approval. The political distance between the two countries had grown wider than Britain realized. The U.S. had stepped into a world leadership role that required caution, diplomacy, and global responsibility. Britain was still thinking like an empire with the right to act first and ask questions later. This mismatch in perspectives created a moment of profound misunderstanding, one that would reshape the fate of nations. Britain pressed forward confidently, convinced the United States would come around. It did not imagine a scenario where Washington would refuse support. It certainly did not imagine a scenario where America would use financial pressure to force Britain to back down. But that was exactly what was coming. The button was pushed, the plan was set in motion, and London expected American backing. What it got instead was something that felt like betrayal. When the first bombs fell on Egypt and British leaders congratulated themselves on how smoothly the plan seemed to be unfolding, almost no one in London was thinking about the real battlefield. They were watching the Mediterranean, the Sinai, the Suez Canal. They were counting planes, ships, and troop movements. What they were not watching closely enough was the pound. For all of Britain's experience, all of its military tradition, all of its confidence that it could still shape the world, its greatest vulnerability was sitting quietly in bank vaults and financial ledgers. Britain had troops, ships, and decades of imperial swagger, but it did not have dollars. The truth was brutal. After World War II, Britain was drowning in debt, and its gold and dollar reserves were dangerously low. It did not have the financial capacity to sustain a long conflict. Every operation, every shipment, every drop of fuel required dollars, not pounds. And the United States controlled access to those dollars. Britain could not buy oil without American approval. It could not stabilize its currency without American loans. It could not approach the International Monetary Fund without American influence. This was a new kind of dependency, one that Britain had not fully accepted. The empire still looked powerful, but its economy was fragile, stretched thin, and held together by the assumption that the U.S. would always offer quiet support. What Britain did not expect was that Eisenhower had reached a breaking point. When he realized that his closest allies had staged a secret war behind his back, he was furious. But his response was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was quiet, cold, and devastating. Eisenhower understood that he did not need to send troops or threaten military action. He did not need to shout or posture. All he had to do was refuse to support the pound. Without American backing, Britain's currency would collapse almost instantly. And so, he delivered a chilling ultimatum. The United States would withdraw all financial support for the British pound unless Britain stopped the invasion and withdrew its forces. Even more terrifying, Eisenhower threatened to sell off U.S.-held British bonds, a move that would cause the pound to crash overnight. He also instructed the IMF to deny Britain any emergency assistance. It was an economic trapdoor, and all Eisenhower had to do was walk away and let gravity do the rest. The pressure worked almost immediately. Inside the British government, panic spread quickly. The Chancellor of the Exchequer examined the numbers and delivered the message every leader dreaded. The country was days away from a full-blown economic collapse. Not months, not weeks, days. The pound was on life support. Without U.S. dollars, Britain could not buy essential imports like oil and food. It could not fund the war, stabilize the government's finances, or maintain public confidence. The empire that had once controlled a quarter of the world could not pay its bills without American approval. What made the moment even more striking was the restraint behind it. Eisenhower did not want a war with Egypt. He did not want the Soviet Union to seize the opportunity and step deeper into the Middle East. And he certainly did not want to reward Britain and France for trying to drag the world back into an age of colonial intervention. This was not just foreign policy. It was a lesson, a correction, a statement. Eisenhower wanted to make it clear that the rules of global power had changed. Influence was not measured in ships or colonies anymore. It was measured in currency, credit, and economic leverage. And in that world, the United States set the terms. For the U.S., using financial pressure instead of military force accomplished everything at once. It stopped the war, avoided escalation, and protected America's reputation in the newly decolonizing world. But for Britain, the message was devastating. It meant that its status as a global power was no longer defined by history, tradition, or pride. It was determined by its dependence on American economic support. And there was no way to fight that. No army could rescue the pound. No fleet could stabilize the currency. Britain had run headfirst into the reality it had been avoiding for a decade. This was the moment the U.S. discovered the deadliest weapon in its arsenal was not the bomb, it was the dollar. Without firing a single shot, America forced an empire to its knees. In cabinet meetings, British ministers were forced to confront the unthinkable. They had to choose between continuing the war or saving their economy. If they kept fighting, the pound would collapse, and the government might fall with it. If they backed down, they would lose the canal, lose credibility, and reveal to the world that Britain no longer had the power it claimed. And with the pound on life support, Britain faced a choice: keep fighting or surrender to its own ally. Britain's decision to back down from a Suez intervention was not simply a tactical retreat. It was a moment that exposed the limits of a once dominant empire and forced the world to see that the balance of power had shifted for good. When Britain agreed to withdraw its forces, followed reluctantly by France and Israel, it was clear to everyone watching that this was not a negotiated compromise or a diplomatic adjustment. It was a humiliation. Newspapers across Europe, the Middle East, and the United States described it as one of the most dramatic collapses of prestige in modern history. Britain had gone in expecting a quick, decisive operation. Instead, it was leaving in a hurry, under pressure from the very country it believed would support it. The optics were devastating. A nation that once ruled the seas was now being told to stop its actions by a nation that did not even have to raise its voice. What made the moment even more powerful was how swiftly the entire world interpreted the outcome. Former colonies, many of which still watched Britain with a mix of resentment and respect, saw unmistakable proof that the old empire no longer had the leverage it once claimed. The Arab world celebrated Nasser as the man who stood up to three powerful nations and forced them to blink. His rise to hero status reshaped politics from Cairo to Baghdad. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union used the crisis as propaganda gold, declaring that Western alliances were fractured and that the capitalist powers were weak and divided. Within a matter of weeks, the narrative was no longer about a canal or even a failed invasion. It was about global perception, and that perception was unambiguous. The United States, not Britain, now had the ability to decide the outcome of international crises. At the center of this shift was not a military clash or a dramatic standoff. It was money. The dollar, which had already begun to dominate global finance after World War II, became the undeniable cornerstone of international power. Nations around the world saw the Suez Crisis as a test case that revealed a deeper truth. Real influence came from controlling financial flows, not colonial territories. The United States could influence IMF decisions, control access to emergency dollars, and shape the fate of currencies like the British pound. It could determine whether a nation could afford to keep fighting or had no choice but to stop. Countries that previously tried to balance themselves between the old empire and the new one now understood that only one of those powers could actually stabilize their economies. In a world where oil shipments, trade agreements, and international loans determined the fate of governments, the dollar was not just a currency. It was a lifeline, and the United States held it firmly in its hands. This realization accelerated a shift that had already begun, but had not yet become obvious. After 1945, the British Empire slowly loosened its grip, granting independence to India, Pakistan, and numerous other regions. But many historians argue that the formal end of empire was not the true moment of collapse. World War II weakened Britain physically, but the nation still believed it had a central role to play in global leadership. The Suez Crisis shattered that illusion. In 1956, for the first time, Britain was forced to accept that it no longer had the authority to act independently on the world stage. It could not wage war without American support. It could not stabilize its own currency without American dollars. It could not claim global leadership while being financially dependent on the very ally it hoped would follow its lead. This was not the symbolic end of empire. It was the practical one, the moment where Britain stopped being a global decision-maker and became a secondary player in a system designed and dominated by the United States. Empires throughout history usually fall in dramatic fashion, with battles, invasions, uprisings, or revolutions marking the end of their influence. But the British Empire's true collapse did not happen on a battlefield. It happened in quiet meetings, financial negotiations, and diplomatic exchanges. It happened when a nation that once dictated the economic rules of the world was forced to comply with the rules set by another. The Suez Crisis showed that power had changed hands not through violence, but through economic leverage, and it marked the beginning of the modern world order, where financial pressure could achieve what armies could not. What makes the story so striking is how subtle the decisive blow was. The United States did not deploy soldiers. It did not threaten military action. It simply used money, timing, and global influence to force a result that reshaped decades of international politics. And the most astonishing part is that this shift was not temporary. It defined the rest of the 20th century and still shapes the 21st. When Britain pulled back from Suez, it unknowingly stepped into a new reality, one in which the United States set the pace, defined the terms, and held the core economic power that others depended on. That moment in 1956 was the real break, the moment Britain moved from leading the world to following it. And what is wild is that it did not take a single American soldier to make it happen. It only took financial pressure, strategic patience, and an understanding that in the new world, the most powerful weapons were not ships or tanks, but dollars, credit, and global trust. The Suez Crisis was not just the end of an era, it was a quiet demonstration of how power truly works. It showed that influence does not always vanish in explosions or headlines. Sometimes it shifts silently through currencies, loans, and decisions made far from a battlefield. In 1956, the world saw that financial leverage could reshape nations faster than armies ever could. And that truth still defines global politics today. If this story helped you see the modern world a little differently, let me know in the comments. I would genuinely love to hear what you think.